Hello and welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this 22nd Sunday after Pentecost, when our gospel reading is written in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. Jesus and the disciples came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This story of blind Bartimaeus is the last of the healing miracles in Mark's Gospel, and it is one of two miracles in which Jesus heals a blind man. The other one is recounted in chapter 8 of Mark. It's about the blind man of Bethsaida who has a kind of two-step healing. And these two healing stories, the blind man of Bethsaida, which begins in chapter 8, verse 22, and this one of blind Bartimaeus at the end of chapter 10, form a kind of bracket around a segment of Mark's gospel in which discipleship, the character of discipleship, what makes for truly following Jesus, is and has been at issue. 3 times within this section on discipleship, Jesus tells the disciples about his destiny, that they are on the way to Jerusalem, where he will be betrayed, handed over to the authorities, put on trial, condemned, crucified, and after 3 days rise again. This characterizes the section on discipleship, which the stories about healing blindness begin and end. Now, there are other links between this passage and other points in Mark's Gospel. The language of the blind man calling out to Jesus, and then Jesus saying, after he became aware of him, saying to the group around him, "Call him here." And they're saying to blind Bartimaeus, "Get up, go, he is calling you." These call to our minds the earlier scenes where Jesus calls Peter and Andrew, his first disciples, and then calls James and John, the next 2 disciples. How, as Jesus is about to teach about his passion in chapter 9, in this section on discipleship, it says he called the disciples to him to hear that teaching. Those whom in chapter 3 as a group he had called to follow him. And then there's the aspect of the attempt to obstruct the access of this blind man who simply seeks help from Jesus, but many, it is said, tried to stop him. This is echoing the woman with the hemorrhage who came up to Jesus in the crowd, touched his robe. He felt power go out from him, turned and said, "Who touched me?" And those around him said, "Oh, Lord, how could you possibly know?" trying to obscure the identification of that woman and obstruct her interaction with Jesus. Or when there are those who would bring children to Jesus for him to bless them, and the disciples tried to keep them away, and Jesus said, "Let them come, do not obstruct them." Or the exorcist whom the disciples found casting out demons in Jesus' name, and they wanted to stop the exorcist, and Jesus says, "Don't stop that person. Whoever is not against us is for us." Those, it seems, who are closest to Jesus are portrayed consistently as trying to obstruct the access that others, especially those on the margins, those of any kind of suspect or dubious character or identity, might have. They seek to obstruct. Jesus welcomes. And then there's Jesus' question to Bartimaeus: "What do you want me to do for you?" If you have been following the Bible for worship in recent weeks, you will recognize that as the exact same question that Jesus asked his disciples, James and John, when they came to him, hoping that he would offer them places at his right hand and at his left when he comes in his victory or his glory. And Jesus says to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" They sought places of glory. Bartimaeus seeks simply to be healed, to be granted again his sight, to be given a very basic physical sense, which will help to bring him back into the human community in which we all thrive. And then, after he is healed, he follows Jesus on the way. This way that Jesus has been traveling ever since chapter 8, the way of discipleship, the way into Jerusalem, where condemnation and death and resurrection await. All of these elements make this a pivotal 7 short verses in Mark's gospel, talking about discipleship and seeing. Some of the themes that emerge from these connections are the contrast with the disciples who seem consistently not to get it, not to see. "Don't you yet understand?" Jesus asks. There is a concern for the marginalized, for the one who is blind and begging by the side of the road and calls out to Jesus from a distance. There is God's question: what is most important to you? What do you want me to do for you? There is the persistent confidence of Bartimaeus that this is the Son of David who can heal and offer him a different future. And he is not dissuaded by those who would discourage and obstruct him. And there is the immediate response. Immediately, Peter and Andrew got up and followed Jesus. Immediately, James and John left their father in the nets and followed Jesus. And immediately, Bartimaeus is healed, and he gets up and follows Jesus on the way. This way, as I've suggested, is bracketed by Mark by the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida and now blind Bartimaeus. And the blind man at Bethsaida, it's a curious miracle. It's one that really requires 2 steps. Jesus spits and rubs the spittle on the man's eyes and says, "What do you see?" And he says, "Well, I see something sort of like maybe trees walking." And then Jesus touches him again, and his sight clears. Mark seems to be implying that there is seeing, and then there is seeing. That there are different levels at which we can see even Jesus, and at which we can see this way of discipleship on which we are embarking and have been traveling with Jesus. Up until chapter 8, before the blind man of Bethsaida is healed, Mark's story has been about Jesus, the healer, Jesus, the wonder worker, Jesus, the teacher with authority and amazing insights. Jesus, the superstar, if you will. Jesus, the prominent figure and in whose posse or entourage or fandom everyone would want to be. But then there's another layer of seeing that comes on the way of discipleship in chapters 8 through 10, and that is the way of the cross, the way of suffering, the way of sacrificial giving of oneself for the sake of others, the way of discipleship. And at the end of that section, Bartimaeus sees immediately all of that and thus follows Jesus. Now, of course, Bartimaeus, like virtually every other one of Jesus' followers, except his mother and a few other women, Bartimaeus too will abandon Jesus when it comes to the cross. It is not the case that everyone can take up the way of discipleship. And for those who read this story from a place of marginalization, from a place of impairment, from a place in which life is not as full as it could be for them, this healing story pronounces a word of hope that in Jesus there is healing. You will see. There is also a word of hope for those who feel they suffer no impairment, who are hale and healthy and have sight and sense about them. And here the story is about another layer of seeing. It's seeing Jesus as the one who calls us to the way of discipleship, who calls us to himself and says, "Follow me." God bless.